everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for episode 10 of season 2 of Revise and Resubmit. I'm Dr. Kim Bissell, the Southern Progress Endowed Professor in Magazine Journalism and the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Communication and Information Sciences at the University of Alabama.
And I'm Dr. Annalisa Boland, an Assistant Professor in the Department of Communication Studies, also at the University of Alabama. And we both work in the Institute for Communication and Information Research, or the ICIR, at UA.
So many places that I could start with this conversation, including, but not limited to, how many ZZ Top concerts have you been to, Annalisa?
None.
And the only reason this blast from the past is even being mentioned is because our next guest may very well have set the record on this one. But no spoiler alert here. You're going to have to tune in to find out if he has.
Yes. And I have to admit that I, even after this conversation, had to go look up ZZ Top. But I did, and incredible. So one of the things that we have all experienced, either directly or indirectly, is the struggle of journalists, today's journalists, and what they have had to face and continue to face while doing their jobs. And this goes beyond just having just a hard job, and really addresses all of the outside factors that journalists have to deal with while they're trying to report on the stories that they are breaking all over the world.
Our next guest has experienced historical and research that he'll be discussing related to journalism practices and journalism ethics. As a former reporter himself, Dr. Chris Roberts knows all about the field of journalism and studies journalistic practices, and will be sharing with us more about this ongoing project where he's conducting interviews with graduates of our own program here at UA to learn more about the challenges they face and the successes they've had.
With that, we'd like to give a warm welcome to Dr. Chris Roberts, an associate professor in the Department of Journalism and Creative Media. And bonus, maybe we'll learn about how his ZZ Top session began. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks for joining us today, Chris.
It is a pleasure to be here.
Well, we are thrilled to have you. But before we get into your research, Chris, I think our listeners need to hear more about your ZZ Top fandom. Haven't you set some kind of record for the total number of ZZ Top concerts you've seen live?
Probably among Southern Baptist deacons, I am up there in ZZ Top concert stuff. I saw them in Styx the week I graduated high school in 1983. And Rick Bragg, this is absolutely true, Rick Bragg, who works with us, he gave me a ZZ Top 8-track back in 1979 or 80. And so that was just the coolest thing. And so I have a thing for ZZ Top, and a former student of mine got me on the front row.
Whoa!
The last time I saw them, I saw a piece of Dusty's beard actually fall out of his hair, out of his head, and kind of just waft in the light there. But we were close enough to grab that piece of hair, but I held back.
So that is a fun fact I'm not sure many of our listeners will know about you. But shifting our gear to research, can you tell our listeners briefly about who you are, where you're from, and what you do?
Well, I am an Army brat from Alabama, and I'm a news guy at heart who moved to academia. I was nearly middle age, and instead of, buying a sports car or doing something stupid, I became a doctoral student at the University of South Carolina. I've been a journalist since I was 14. I rode my bicycle to the Jacksonville News in my hometown after my dad retired from the military, and answered the question correctly when they said, "Will you work for free?" And so I started, I literally met Rick Bragg, who was 19 and then the sports editor of the paper. And I was doing radio at the Jacksonville State University, has college radio station. And, anybody who would work for free who had a low voice. So by 9th and 10th grade, I was in radio and I was in print, worked for the Anniston Star covering sports. I tell my students I have seen Bear Bryant in his underpants.
Wow.
Absolutely true. And went to Jacksonville State for a couple of years, then came to Alabama as a junior, 4 years, straight through, got my master's here, met my wife, who's from Tuscaloosa. And during that time, I began to teach. I was an adjunct after I graduated. I was a teaching assistant when I was a master's student, adjunct at Samford in South Carolina. I've taught high school and college students at church for decades, so I'm fairly comfortable in the classroom. As a journalist, I was at the Birmingham News as an intern and then went full-time and covered business and politics and government. I was a weekend editor. And then I developed skills in the early 1990s for what they called computer-assisted reporting. Literally using computers before Microsoft Windows to create databases and analyze databases and write stories out of them.
I remember this
I wrote a technology column that was syndicated nationally. You know, a lot of columns about AOL, as it turns out. In '94, I wrote the story that put the word internet on the front page of the Birmingham News.
Oh my goodness!
What I'm saying is I'm old. I left there and went to the state newspaper in Columbia, South Carolina in 1998 as a writer and an editor. And I was the data guy. I ran the investigations unit. Then I was in the business staff. And during all that time, I was thinking about doctoral work. The professor I had here when I was a student is named Jay Black, who co-founded the Journal of Mass Media Ethics in the 1980s. He was a mentor and taught me a ton as a student. And I was his assistant with the journal when he was department head here and helped keep it on track while he was doing all these other things. And so ethics became a thing that I thought about as a student and then as a guy who was in the news business, and always had a heart for research from that. And he put me on the editorial board. So we fast forward to middle age. I'm 38 years old, have a job offer from the Atlanta newspaper, and I'd been wanting to work for the Atlanta paper since I was a teenager and lived in Atlanta. But I turned it down and instead started doctoral work at the University of South Carolina in 2003 or so. Worked full-time at the newspaper while I was a doctoral student, and then they hired me as an instructor in 2006, moved me to tenure track when I was working on my dissertation was done in 2007. But it's strange to work where you got your degree. You need to cross-pollinate to learn from others. And Kim, you may not remember this, but we sat next to each other randomly on a flight in 2005 from San Antonio to Atlanta.
I do remember that. Yeah, and now you've just outed me with my age as well. No, I'm joking.
Well, your children were very, very young then. And you told me that an Alabama job would be opening up in the next couple of years. And so it did. And on December 5th of 2007, literally 50 years to the day that Bear Bryant left Texas A&M to coach at Alabama, telling everybody that Mama called, so he had to come back to Bama. I don't know if that was what the lead of my application letter was. I don't know if that's why I got the gig, but I've been here since 2008.
Wow. So you've mentioned some technology and you've mentioned ethics. Can you tell us how those might intersect when it comes to journalism?
Well, that's a great question, and I wish I had a better answer than I do. But it's information is information, whether you get it from a computer or you get it from a person. And, it is your job to verify that information and decide what's important and publish it. And it's just computers have speeded up the mess in some ways. Just because it's in a computer, people tend to believe it. I think we have students who believe that if it's not on the internet, it must not exist.
Right.
Or if it's on the internet, then it must be true.
Also true.
And so we spend a lot of time working with students saying, okay, now how do you know this? You can't just cut and paste from a website or send emailed questions to somebody. You've got to make the phone calls. You've got to do the shoe leather work. And as an ethicist, that really matters. And it only is getting quicker now that we have websites that are spitting stuff out. We have the ability to publish stuff without really doing the journalism that's involved. People are able to go to websites that may or may not comport with reality but it does match what they already believe. We've got systems that are able to track us wherever we are. My cell phone follows me around and the world knows where I am. These are things, and as we think about artificial intelligence, these are things that ethicists have to be involved in order to not make the mess any worse than it already is.
So I feel like you're going to be pretty good at this, but if you had to come up with a headline for one of your more interesting findings, what would that headline be?
Doing what's right doesn't necessarily make you trusted.
Love it.
Oh,
Love it.
all right. Tell us more.
Yes.
Well, I will say this, that I am a generalist with specifics. I love that mass communication is at the intersection of everything. Politics, business, entertainment, health, science, everything comes through mass media, which makes it wonderful for what it is that we research. And I think that ethics is at the intersection of mass communication. And so my research is really about ethics, credibility, and journalism practice, which are separate but also quite intersected when I think about the research that I do. But where that comes from, in 2007, I co-authored a paper with a graduate student, Lindsay Conlon, who's now at Southern Miss. Mm-hmm. We created a news story and a series of reader comments. Some of the comments were positive, some were negative, some neutral. We got them from a similar story published in some other newspapers. And so we had real comments from real people. And what we wanted to test was the commenting system used, whether the comment was moderated or not, whether humans did it or computers did it, whether it was done before it was posted or after it was posted. Because we were wondering if there was any sort of difference in perceived credibility of the news organization and the story itself. But of course, being fine scholars, we also had the control that just had the news story.
Mm-hmm. So,
and what we found, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
Well, what we found was that the moderation system didn't matter in terms of credibility. What mattered was that simply having comments underneath the story hurt the news organization's credibility.
Oh.
So, Chris, I'm going to have to ask this because I think it's kind of important in, the era that we're in right now in terms of credibility and trustworthiness. So, what are the things that you tell your students or teach your students about ways to gain credibility? You had mentioned you can't just copy it from the internet and you can't just believe everything on the internet. But we're in this era, obviously, and you know this better than any of us, where the credibility and trustworthiness of journalists is so low. They've just taken a huge beat down. So how do you keep your students positive and motivated and excited about going into the field? And how do you train them to do whatever they can to keep and maintain that credibility?
Well, what I tell them is that they are ultimately not responsible for how credible they are perceived. Because ultimately credibility is a message recipient attribute. You can be the most ethical person. You can do absolutely the right things. You can be a terrific journalist doing everything that you need to be doing ethically, and people still may not believe you for their own reasons because they have a partisan bias. They don't understand how journalism works. But ultimately, you're not responsible for it. You need to do what you need to do because it's the right thing to do and let other things take care of it. I'm sort of deontological about this, is you do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, and you can't be as responsible about the consequences as you might want to be.
So I'm trying to think of, how do the students get any kind of experience feeling what it's like to be perceived as not credible?
Or to be hated.
I'm giving away a final exam question for the ethics class next week, where a 10-point question is, okay, you go home for the holiday dinner and an uncle asks you what you're majoring in. And when you say journalism, all of a sudden you get all the complaints you hear about journalism, fake news, which is a propaganda tool, and all those other things. And my question for the students is, how do you reply?
Oh, I like
it.
So can you tell us about one of the more involved research projects that you've worked on over the course of your academic career and what it looked like?
Well, I'm working on a project right now with 5 other researchers. It's a longitudinal thing where we are tracking the moral development of recent mass media graduates. We've got 200 graduates between 2007 and 2019 from Alabama, Penn State, Quinnipiac, Missouri, Colorado, and Oklahoma. And we are tracking their moral development over 3 or 4 years, depending on how this pandemic plays out.
Mm-hmm.
And we want to look at a lot of things to be able to add to the literature about moral development theory, particularly as it pertains to young professionals. We want to see how the research instruments that we use work and don't work together, and to see how we can inform media educators about how they can better prepare students for what they're going to face when they graduate. So we've done some baseline measurements of moral development among these students the semester they graduated. And now we're tracking them with a series of qualitative and quantitative measures over the next few years. I've got 49 Alabama graduates that I'm following. We had 50. One of them died not too long ago. And I should stop right here and tell you, Kim, as a person who is with the Institutional Review Board, that I broke IRB protocol after this student died, where one of the questions we ask in a life story interview is, who is a role model in your life and what attributes do you try to live out?
Uh-huh.
And this former student talked about her mother, about what a wonderful mother she had and all the things she learned. And when she died, I broke the rules and sent her mama a letter saying, this is what your late daughter said about you and how wonderful it is, and you should know this.
Wow.
And she wrote me back and said that how much she appreciated the letter, and then she hung it on the wall next to her daughter's diploma.
Oh my
And the ethicist in me says it's okay to break a rule sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope you understand. And this is about involvement, because we're crawling into the lives of these students and asking them about the most personal and difficult and best things in their lives. And that requires being there. So I have been to tons of states to interview these students before the pandemic, because we asked some really hard questions, the best and worst experiences of their lives, what they think about political and religious issues and ethical dilemmas they've been involved in. And I will tell you, 30 to 40% of the students have teared up at some point during these interviews, thinking about something sad or something about good in their lives.
I'm sure.
And so I have been our students come from all over the United States, and they scatter when they're done. So I've been to 14 or 15 states, Maryland to Wyoming, California to Michigan, Oregon, South Carolina, to talk to these students. And they get a kick out of it because it may be free therapy for some of them. Others really want to help, and others want to make connections, and it's fascinating. So far, we've won an award with the first paper that we submitted. It's been accepted for a journal. Our second paper is it's a big deal.
Yeah.
Our second paper is at ICA. We'll see if that one hits. And we've got many more papers to write over the next several years, and maybe we'll turn this into a book when we're done. But we're talking about hundreds of students and 6 researchers from across the United States. There's a lot going on here.
Yeah.
So, I feel like, you have the institutional connection to these students, but I feel like my initial reaction, if I got an email that was like, hey, can I study your moral development? I'd be like, no, please don't. What are you going to find? So how do you get your participants on board and establish some trust and rapport?
Well, I asked faculty to submit the names of students they believe are morally developed. One of the things we're looking at is looking for moral exemplars, young adults who could grow up to be highly morally developed people. Mm-hmm. And so we were taking those things. And then I teach an intro to mass communication class with 200 students pretty much every semester. And so I was able to tap into the students who know me and who I know from that class and other things. And of course, it's anonymous. we are never going to talk about any students and anything they say where that student could be identified.
Mm-hmm.
And so by giving them the freedom to tell life stories is a powerful thing. The journalist in me knows that to some degree, people want to talk about themselves.
Yeah. Well, so it sounds to me, I mean, if you're traveling all over the country to conduct these interviews, that's got to get kind of expensive. Do you have funding for this, or how is all that working?
Well, we've been fortunate. David Craig at the University of Oklahoma helped receive a grant that helped some of us do some traveling. And then I was able to earn a University of Alabama $6,000 grant that has been helpful. We are not able to travel during the pandemic, so I do a lot of Zooming. I've got 6 Zooms with students in the next 6 days as we try to wrap up this year.
Wow.
But we've been fortunate so far, and hope that more money will come as we continue with this and the work gets out and people see that it needs to be continued to be funded.
And how do you, so this is obviously a huge undertaking, not only just with the students from UA who have scattered, but working with other colleagues. So obviously it's collaborative, but what are some of the challenges that you've encountered with this scale of work?
Well, we are very fortunate that all of us think about ethics, and it really does matter. We have been together. We do a lot of Zooming. We've got a central cloud site where all the documents go and everybody has access to it. We all met in Denver a year ago and talked about what we wanted to do over a long weekend. I picked up an interview with a former student while I was there.
Wow.
Nice.
And some of us are former newspaper people, and that really matters because it's about pulling all the parts together. And so for the paper we did that was completed earlier this month, I was essentially the editor on the thing. Different scholars wrote different parts. They threw them all together. I took them all, put them in one document, wrote through it to make it seem more like it was one voice, making sure that the research questions and hypotheses matched throughout the paper, that we didn't raise questions that we didn't answer. And I'm working with incredibly bright, smart, wonderful people. We're undefeated so far in getting things published. And we don't have prima donnas in this. It's a mix of full professors and associate professors and assistant professors. And so we are incredibly respectful, and I think we've been deferential while we're still being academically rigorous. And it's a wonderful group of people, and we've had a lot of fun.
I mean, that's always great to hear. I know that, collaborations, it often are very positive and, at the end of the day can produce like really amazing either books or journal articles or whatever it is. But, sometimes they're not always as positive. But shifting gears a little bit, what we wanted to ask you about was your experience with revising and resubmitting and maybe persisting through that process. Some of our listeners may be graduate students who submit a journal article for review and gets a desk reject, or they get an R&R and it's basically, all right, we like nothing about this, redo the whole study. So can you tell us a little bit about your experience with that, or maybe a favorite comment you've gotten from a reviewer? But basically, like how to stay positive and persist through the process.
Well, a couple of things. And first of all, I am still in contact with some of my professors. Dr. Black, we wrote a textbook together. And I'm working on the second edition. He is fully retired. One of my professors was Charles Self, who ended up being dean at Oklahoma. We published a book chapter together. A lot of what ethics researchers do are chapters for books or invited things. But I still do, I'm a qualitative and quantitative researcher. I'm a generalist, and, the research approach I take depends on the question we're trying to answer. And I think that connections matter. And again, I'm a middle-aged guy and came into it fairly late. And so I asked people about stuff. I would go to these meetings that I had never been to and had to learn how to be an academic. My outside study when I was working on my PhD was higher ed administration, because I didn't know how this tribe worked, and so I had to figure it out. And so part of it was reading the journals and asking a lot of people. And I think connections matter. And I don't mean that like, you know this editor, he's going to publish it because he loves you. But twice when I was really young as a scholar, and I mean, 40 years old, but really young as a scholar, having changed from writing newspaper stories to having to write in an academic way, which took a lot of changing in my head. Mm-hmm. I submitted to journals where I knew the editor, and the papers went out for blind review. And I know the editors didn't give me a publication because they think I'm a nice guy or they knew me, but the papers were good enough. And the editors in both those situations were incredibly helpful in helping me think better. And that's, and maybe it was because of the connection. Maybe it was, and I think it was because just of who these people are.
Right.
But being able to make those connections really matters. And thinking like an editor is what really matters. And again, I like working in collaboration because I think all God's children need an editor. But as a journalist, I was taught to think like a reader, but really taught to think like an editor, because a good editor thinks like a reader. Mm-hmm. And now when I do academic work, I think about the reader, obviously, but for academic journals, I am thinking about the editor and those blind reviewers, making sure that I make the best case that I can and answer all the questions that the submission is going to raise, and be ready to answer what it is that they have.
Those are very good tips. Thank you for sharing that. That's very, very helpful.
And then finally, Chris, we're going to switch gears just a little bit more as we wrap up. And as academics, we have the good fortune of being able to travel to different countries or different cities around the U.S. for conferences, or to collect data and present research. What is one of the favorite places that you have visited where you have traveled to present research or collect data? Or where is somewhere that you are looking forward to going?
I'm looking forward to going anywhere right now.
Out to dinner is what I have said. I can't wait to just go like across the street out to dinner.
Yes.
Exactly. The favorite part of the research is being able to tie it to other things. I flew to Denver for a research interview, and my wife, Melissa, whom you know and we all love very much, figured out a way to travel with me. So we hit Denver. She had never been there. I interviewed one of the participants. We went to Wyoming. We saw a Wyoming football game.
Oh,
then we drove to the northern part of Wyoming and interviewed a student, then drove back. A couple of years ago, we flew to San Jose and then to San Francisco, interviewed somebody, and then we drove back across country. I stopped in Dallas and elsewhere to do an interview. And I should say this as a newspaper person who has written things that have led to people being indicted and misuse of money. I made sure that I didn't, we didn't commingle money. I was about that stuff, but we drove along the way. So, we saw Yosemite, we saw Death Valley, we saw the Grand Canyon. Along the way, I was shooting video for my MC 101 online class. And, my wife learned how to knit, and we sang 70s on 7 the whole way.
Nice.
I love it. Chris, it has been such a pleasure getting to talk to you today and to learn more about your research. Thank you for sharing your experiences with us and all of our listeners.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris.